Hi guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. As always, I'm your host Lefarius, and in this week's show we will be taking a look over the arcade hit Bobble, which I'm guessing should need no introduction. It's something everyone will have played or have seen at some point in their lives. It's been on every system known to man, and I'm hoping to do my best to cover this as much as possible, and hopefully the Amiga version will be on par with the arcade version. Our first news item this week was submitted over on the Discord channel. That's always in the show notes, by the way. Anyway, White Fox, one of our regular listeners, thought a YouTube video from Amiga Bill was well worth a mention. I'm sure he will be listening in to this on his travels, so thanks Bill for giving us something to talk about. What we have is basically a full interview with an early Amiga engineer. Now this fella, Joe Decor, was filmed quite recently discussing the very early days of the Amiga hardware. Joe talks about being one of the invisible workers, so to speak, who left Commodore shortly after the Amiga 1000 was due out, so he managed to miss the infamous case signing ceremony. There's a lot of detail about what actually happened back then, including bits with J Minor, and it made for a really fascinating 20 minutes. A few bits that I heard aren't even mentioned in any of the Commodore history books, and it's great to hear a new side of the story, especially from other people who you might not have even thought about before. Highly recommended viewing from me and White Fox, so go show some support and let Bill know what you think in the comments. Moving on to our next bit of news. I'm always on the lookout for new and interesting games to cover, and after spending a couple of hours on Pouet this week, I came across a game called BioJet. This came out just a few months back, and from everything I've seen, it's a take on the old Atari 2600 classic Hero. You fly around the levels in a jetpack, collecting lots of items and rescuing people before you manage to run out of fuel. This is mostly a new title, but the guys behind it have worked some jiggery pokery on a game they made back in the 90s called Cybergene. They've lifted the graphics from its MS-DOS code and rewrited it to work with it all in 68K assembly. Stuff like this always seems to need souped up Amigas, but it works on all Amiga systems, even the 500 and its 512K of chip RAM. It's not just on Pouet, you can get it over on Aminet, especially if you want to keep your eye on any updates, because they seem to be making a lot of changes to it, and I think they've got more plans in line for it. I know I haven't said this in a while, but we haven't had any sort of iTunes reviews, it's Apple Podcasts now. They've gone and changed all that. That has been a bit of a pain behind the scenes as well. Anyway, I still need reviews. We need to get seen and get mentioned and stuff. If you've been listening for a while now and would like to comment on what you think about the show, please leave us a review, because it's the only way I can get the show noticed and shared and out there. I want us to grow as time goes on. I promise I've got so much more content to come, and we will get bigger. For now though, we are just about out of time for Amiga news this week. Let's see what Bub and Bob have been up to of late in the arcade smash Bobble. Having covered the sequels to Bobble, it might seem strange to be doing a show so long after Rainbow Islands and Parasol Stars. But this is the final episode for the trilogy, and I wanted to tie a neat bow in the lot, and here we are. The previous games might be sequels in name, but at the core they are totally different games, and it seemed only fitting to give them the AMIGArama treatment. I think I could argue that the first game inspired loads of platformers over the years with its cutesy graphics and gameplay style that I'd feel a bit odd not doing a show on at all. It's also one of those games I've played so many times over the years I've lost count. I'm not even sure what systems I've tried it on, it's been on everything. I've always drifted back to the Game Boy one though, oddly enough, so this is probably my first go on the Amigas. It was published by Firebird, which I think were a BT company, I'm not entirely sure now. They worked on Adventure Quest, Dungeon Adventure, Guild of Thieves, things like that. It does sound a very strange link. Also Virus as well, not forgetting that one. The developer was Software Creations. They did Aliex, Bionic Commando, Gauntlet 3, Ghouls and Ghosts, Puzznic, lots and lots of arcade ports, so maybe these were the ideal guys for this sort of thing. It came out in 1989. On a single floppy disk, it was for 2 players and priced at £19.99, which is about the going rate for games back then. The coder behind it was David J. Broadhurst. He might sound familiar, he did Assassin, Bionic Commando, Ghouls and Ghosts, Sly Spy, a lot of games there spread across the Amiga. Graphics wise, Andrew R. Frelfall, Bionic Commando as well, Ghouls and Ghosts, LED Storm and Sly Spy, so not too many there. For the music, it was the legendary David Whittaker. He did Alfred Chicken, awesome game I'm sure, Carrier Command, Dan Dare 3, Gold of the Aztecs, Krusty's Funhouse, god when did we do that? It must have been about episode 19, Platoon, Shadow of the Beast, straight away there, some massive titles. From an interview online, I managed to learn that David J. Broadhurst had hardly any help from Taito with Bobble whatsoever. They just dropped off an arcade cabinet, then scrambled. So no sprites, plans or code, and the poor guy had to play the game as much as he could and learn it the old-fashioned way. Depending on your point of view, that might not be as bad as it sounds. Usually when a game is ported from the arcade, a few companies would offer a cabinet for the developers to code from, or even a cut down portable suitcase, usually with a board inside to plug and play on a TV. These ports often represented a company brand though, so you'd think with their name being plastered all over the box, they could do all they could to make sure there was at least someone at ground level helping it to be something amazing. You could say this was their only way onto the home market in a lot of cases, so the lack of interest has always been a bit puzzling to me. Anyway, David went a step further than just playing the arcade cabinet, going out of his way to set up a 35mm camera to take lots and lots of pictures, getting to see it all in action and then playing it repeatedly with another member of Software Creation staff, so he could at least get through all the levels and take some very close notes. This was the late 1980s and it doesn't even sound like they had a video camera on hand. You know, the poor guys, this must have been quite some effort to get it onto the screen. Beyond that, it was a straightforward Amiga port, so we will need to dig a little bit deeper and have a look at how the arcade version came about instead. With that in mind, being based in Japan, Fukio Mitsuji came up with Bobble during the 1980s, but sadly he passed away in 2008, and like most Japanese game developers, there isn't much of a story there about what happened behind the scenes, especially with the game's production. Japanese staff I've found always seem to move on and just let the past be the past. They're not really interested in going back and raking over the details, so it's always tough for anyone to find out any sort of information. That's very frustrating for shows like ours, especially when we want to know more and find out what actually happened. I'm sure I've made comment on this before, but it's sad to think that we are getting to the stage where a lot of developers from the 80s and 90s are getting to the point of well, leaving us and passing away, so it always makes me hope that they at least get to share the stories before the worst happens and we lose a lot of that history. One thing I did discover is that Mitsuji agreed to be interviewed briefly for the 2005 release of Taito Legends on the PS2, Xbox and PC. He shared the fact that his main drive for the arcade game stemmed from his desire to make something thrilling and exhilarating for people to play. He made a point that the game was all about its multiplayer mode, where you had to play it cooperatively in order to reach the true ending. That's no easy feat considering there's 120 levels to explore, so compared to other games that were out at the time, I guess the multiplayer is a lot more crucial to finishing all the levels than the single player mode ever was. You really have to go out of your way to work together in order to see all of the stages. I'm afraid I couldn't try out the 2-player mode in our review this week, it was just me, so we'll just have to manage with what we've got. Bobble was also the first arcade game to have a simultaneous 2-player mode, one which most home ports brought across for, well, obvious reasons, and probably why it's still so fondly remembered to this day. Ports wise, this came out on every system known to man, including handheld, every console, every computer, I mean even LCD portable games. There's gotta be stuff I'm probably missing there. This was a big beast of a seller, so you've probably played it on all sorts of different systems by now. There isn't much here for a story. Even the Amiga manual hasn't much beyond a few lines at best. Not wanting to let it drop though, I did manage to find a brief reference to the setup online, so here we go. Baron von Blubber has kidnapped the brothers Bubby and Bobby's girlfriends and turned the brothers into bubble dragons, Bub and Bob. So Bub and Bob have to finish 100 levels in a cave of monsters in order to rescue their girlfriends. I will say that the sequels do expand on the story a bit more, but it's a series of arcade games, so none of that tale's going to be making any appearances on Broadway anytime soon. After choosing 1 or 2 players from the title screen, you fly onto the starting point in a big glossy bubble. To the top left is the stage number and to the right is a black bar which is covered in all the scores, lives and credits for both players. Being a single screen game, the action takes part across multiple floors where Bub or Bob can jump around to reach higher floors or even fall through gaps in the bottom to reappear at the top. Out of all the arcade games I've played, I think this might be the first time that ever was a thing. But don't quote me on that, I've no idea, I've not fact checked it whatsoever. The controls are your typical arcade fare with up for jump and fire to blow a bubble at enemies. Holding fire lets you ride a bubble through the air and offers you plenty of chances to get to higher platforms. Bubbles just continue to float around the screen until they pop or at least hit an enemy, so timing is everything. Hitting an enemy with one bubble will trap them inside and then it's a mad dash to try and jump on or burst them. If you leave a bubble for too long, the enemy or beasties as the manual calls them will escape with a very bad temper tantrum and come back in a rage to cause you all sorts of havoc. Clearing a screen of all beasties will advance you to the next stage. The beasties, God I'm struggling to say that, never stick to one path and wander around aimlessly, jumping down to reach the lower parts of the screen where they might pop back up out of the top if there's a gap or circle back and forth before jumping up and out if they're stuck in one place. They really do have a life of their own and it does give them an interesting take on how they explore the levels. In later levels, some can fling orbs across the play areas, burst your bubbles or bounce around on springs. People might rank this up there as being a bit fixed like Pac-Man with its ghost, but there's such a good range of beasties that the levels take on a whole new challenge all by themselves. Taking one out will transform them into fruits or diamonds. All mean big points and it's a matter of dashing to collect as many as possible without being taken out before the next stage. There are a good selection of green magic bubbles that often appear, These are worth points as well, but can have things like fire or lightning powers inside which can take out surrounding beasties. The best of this is probably the water bubble. Bursting that will send a flood of water rushing down over the floor, taking out anything it hits and even dragging you along if you aren't quick on your feet. A few simple items are here with faster boots and bubbles, as well as exploding bombs or rings of fire. These can be quite rare, so you have to grab them fast or risk losing them completely. Every so often a bubble with a letter in will appear. Collecting these to spell out the word extend goes to the next stage and nets you an extra life. This is quite a fast-paced arcade game, so there's not a lot to go over or explore, so once I've gone through them items there, that's pretty much all there is. For the looks though, Bubble Bobble is as simple as it gets. The Amiga doesn't quite get the 3D effects on the bubbles, but it's a very close representation of the arcade. The platforms are covered in all sorts of different textures and every level is a whirl of colour. Some of the later stage designs have words or enemies drawn as actual floors for you to walk over, so it does a grand job of trying to mimic what the arcade cabinet came up with. A lot of the rooms consist of simple blocks, but with a sneaky way of covering them in lots of colours, the designs take on their own unique appearance. If anyone has played Arkanoid before, you will have a good idea of the sort of look that Bubble Bobble uses. When it comes to the audio, this has the same tune playing throughout most of the game, and for the most part it's a very close rendition of what's on the arcade machine, except it's just a little bit slower. Not enough to notice unless you're a huge fan of the game, but I couldn't help but focus on how it was off by just this little tiny bit. I suspect that's just because he would try to convert this over by listening to it on the arcade machine. Don't let that take anything away from the audio though, because it's a brilliant redo of what's on the machine, and I understand that the Amiga might not be able to reproduce that exactly, but it was just enough to niggle my ear, and you might notice that as well. Probably more so now that I've pointed it out. I'm sorry everybody, I didn't mean to ruin the audio for you. As we move on to the problems this week, I'm actually struggling to find any. To pick holes in this is like going back to poke at a legend. It's always been on the level of Pac-Man in my eyes, and the Amiga does an amazing job with what it's got. I love it when a game has very few issues. It makes for easier shows and stops me grumbling. I mentioned before how the music was a little bit off, and I think that's probably just because during its development, as I said, they were doing their best to replicate what they could see and hear. It's not perfect, but anyone will be hard pressed to see a difference unless you were a hardcore fan. Honestly, I was scrambling for issues, so I've just thought I had to bring it up again. I did discover one problem when I tried this on emulation. Again, there's just nothing against the gameplay. I couldn't make my actual Amiga hardware repeat the same problem, so it might have been my setup. The controls for me were ever so slightly off, almost like there was a delay. I loaded other games on the same setup just to see if they were having problems, but only Bubble Bobble seemed to suffer. The only reason I thought it worth mentioning though is because I know a fair few listeners will go off to try this on emulation, but try another ADF if it seems weird. I had the same problem happen on Amiga Live, so maybe it wasn't my setup at all, I just don't know. Moving on to the magazine scores, Amiga Power gave this 87%, can't disagree there, CU Amiga 84%, Amiga Action 90%, and Amiga Computing the highest at 91%. After we covered Smash TV, I was a bit worried we might end up with yet another poor Amiga arcade conversion, but I was honestly gobsmacked when I started to play this. The magazine scores were spot on. It's nigh on brilliant and has a level of greatness not many games can manage, especially in the Amiga age. With software creations working from, you could say, a really good source material, it helped them create something truly special. Proves my earlier point that all the big studios should have been trying to make a name for their games, because it just helps them, well, in the long run for future releases and sequels and stuff. The beasties are very simple in the way they move around the levels, but thanks to the way they're made to roam, it feels like there's a lot of intelligence behind them. It's almost like AI. The randomness can make a real challenge because no matter which stage you're on, even if the floors are in the same places, the beasties roaming about make it a lot more random each time. Gives you the added bonus of wanting to replay multiple times, which is perfect for a coin guzzling arcade game. The controls hit the right spot and the dragons move around at a fair old pace. Playing it side by side on my main cab, I couldn't quite believe how close the two actually were. The biggest question has to be, does it compare well to the arcade? The stages were all here and they've done their best to come up with what I think might just be the best possible version available. I've played this so many times on different ports and machines, and I've always drifted back to the Nintendo Game Boy. Thanks to, well, I think it was force of habit, I just grew up playing it, but this is probably going to replace that in the long run. I had so much fun playing it, so it's definitely going in my regulars list. If you want mega power-ups or challenging bosses, then you're going to have to go on to play the sequels, because it just doesn't have any, bar the Baron at the end. I have to say, this is as arcade-like as the Amiga can get. Lots of fun and always worth firing up for a quick blast. Very easy to pick up and play, and there's no deep underlying strategy that, say, Pac-Man has, but if you want some high-score gaming, this could be the ideal place to start. Give it a whirl, you won't be disappointed. And now that we've completed the Bubble Bobble trilogy, I have to say I'm sat here looking back at all three that I've done, and I'll have to put this as the second best of the lot. It's just behind Rainbow Islands with Parasol Stars in last place. There's just something about firing them rainbows everywhere I just can't quite get over. I will admit that Bubble Bobble has even got me peeking over at Software Creation's other arcade ports. Bionic Commando and Ghouls and Ghosts seem to be in their catalogue, and they're really tweaking my interest at the moment. If they were capable of making something this good and this great, the rest have got to be pure arcade gold. I mean, I really can't wait to cover them. I think that's about the perfect time to end this week's show. If you've heard anything you disagreed with, or even want to comment on stuff I've been going on about, you can drop me a line on lefarius@amigarama.com, come along to the Twitter page, which is @AmigaRamaPod, or drop us a line on Facebook, which is facebook.com/AmigaRama. I do update on there quite a lot with lots of different photos and adverts and things like that, so it's always worth popping along and seeing what we're up to. If you'd like to offer some support to the show, you can do so over at patreon.com/AmigaRama. If you did, that would put you on our special list of Patreon supporters. We do owe a lot to them, they do help to keep the lights on to some degree. And as always, we send out a big thank you to all of these guys. We couldn't do this show like this without your support. And they are 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, Adam Bradley, Darren Coles, Dudley from Yes Dizine, Gary Heather, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford from Casual Retro Gamer Weekly, Jason Warnes, Laurent Giraud, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Pistol, Kremsky, Quentin Barnes, Richard Legg, Richard Pearson, Steve Engeldo, and finally, Treble. Thanks for listening, and until next time, guys.